Okay, hello, Year 1 English language students. I've split up the really long lecture, 19 PowerPoint slides that I gave you when I introduced you to language and social groups in the first year. And I've tried to split it into slightly more manageable chunks, partly just because I can't save and upload them if they go any longer, but it's probably good for you as well, gives you a break and maybe helps you break it down into different levels. So these little PowerPoint lectures that just help you revise language and social group, going over different areas and hopefully reintroducing you to some of the key concepts, some of the studies, and some of the examples. Okay, so just use them to help you revise. Okay, quick reminder of what social groups are. I'm not going to read the slide to you, I'm sure you can read that. Just remember that social groups covers all the things we've studied for language and diversity. So it also includes gender, it also includes occupation. It's possible that you get a separate question purely on gender or purely on occupation, and you might get a question just on class or on region. But if you get a general question that just says diversity or just says social groups, you can also talk about gender. You can also talk about occupation. Just that I've taught you them separately because they have their own separate studies and approaches. So on these slides, I'm just talking about class, region, age. Okay, those are three other really key features of social group. Just to remind you to talk about language levels. Okay, in your essay question, which is section A on paper 2, and when you are writing your own, question 4 journalism, talk about language levels, talk about phonology, lexis and semantics, grammar. Be specific. Okay. And now the rest of these slides are just reminding you of some of the key concepts that you should be able to talk about and write and use in your essays. And they will really improve your essay writing and they will really improve your journalism answer as well. So, for example, referring to speech communities. Yep. And it sounds really smart and fancy. It's not a difficult concept. Literally, it's just defined there for you. It's a socially defined group or a regionally defined group, and the members within that group share a language variety. Okay? So multicultural London English, if you speak that, you're in a speech community. It's defined by age and it's defined by region. And how you belong to that speech community is usually because you speak more often with people within that speech community than you do with people from outside of it. And what's interesting about that is it explains why teenagers have different language to their family. When they're growing up, when young people are growing up as, infants, then they speak far more often with members of their family than they do with anyone from outside the family. But when people become teenagers, they can start to spend a lot more time with their peer group than they do with their family, and they start to belong to a different speech community. You could refer to something called communicative isolation. That's what allows varieties to develop in the first place, because you're isolated from all the other social groups, and therefore your speech community keeps reinforcing. So that also, you could use that if you're talking about Milroy's Belfast study, the idea of open and closed networks. In a closed network, that's what you get. Communicative isolation. Sounds sad, doesn't it? But more typically, individuals belong to several speech communities. Okay, so your family, you spend a lot of time talking to your family, they are a speech community. Your work colleagues, once you're grown up, you spend a lot of time with your work colleagues. And when you're a teenager, probably more often you spend a lot of time with your friends. So it's worth thinking about that. It'd be a nice revision thing for you to think about. Who do you spend the most time talking to, talking with? Are they all groups from the same community? So if you have a closed network, your friends also belong to the same speech community as your family, also belong to the same speech community as your work colleagues. And that will really work strongly to keep going something like a regional accent and dialect. But as we've said, teens and teenagers' peer groups often isolate themselves. And in terms of identity, so young people will dress differently from their parents, they will have different interests than their parents, they will engage in different social activities to their parents, and they will use language differently. And that's how they develop that sense of themselves as a peer group. Okay, so that was speech communities. Here's another language concept that you should try and get into your writing. And that's the idea of speakers having a linguistic repertoire. Okay, and your linguistic repertoire, or a linguistic repertoire, is the different language varieties that exist within a speech community. So there are linguistic variables within a community, and you can use them or you cannot use them. Okay, so you could think perhaps taboo language is a linguistic variable. Yeah, people within the speech community, some of them use taboo language, some of them don't. And so you may be in one of your speech communities where taboo language is fine and acceptable and you'll use it. There'll be another speech community, another group in which taboo language is not acceptable. So your linguistic repertoire is determined by the language varieties used within your within your speech community. So within your family, it may be that your father uses taboo language, typically, and your mother doesn't. So even in that speech community of your family, there will be different varieties. And if you're a young man growing up, you might think, aha, therefore, when I'm with men, I can use taboo language. And if you figure that out, and that means you've now got a repertoire. And that means you've got this concept of communicative competence. You've figured out, I can use this kind of language in this group, this kind of language in this group. And this also links into this term of code switching. Okay, code switching is the ability to apply language with respect to different social speech situations. A competent speaker can vary their language by applying different registers and styles. And this is a really useful argument to remember, particularly in the opinion article part of things, if you've got to engage with debates about, oh, young people's language is terrible, or, you know, working class regional dialects, non-standard usage is terrible, people are going to look bad. You can bring in this idea that actually people may use that kind of language with their friends or online. It doesn't mean they're going to use that in other and all other contexts. So that's what code switching you can talk about, being able to move backwards and forwards between two languages or two dialects or even two registers of the same language. And if you want to think about this again, we thought about it at the time, you know, think about your membership of speech communities, think about family, friends, peer group, work, college. How and why and when might you switch between different styles? Okay, that's a good place to start with revising. Okay, thank you there. I can stop that one.